Thank you very much, John, for this very kind introduction. And thank you to all of you who are here tonight, who have come to listen. It's an honor for me to be here, quite a daunting one, I have to admit. I'm here in front of colleagues, friends, family, and students. So thank you. I do see this as an opportunity to tell you about my research and career thus far, but also, and perhaps primarily, it's an opportunity to acknowledge the people with whom I've worked over the years and to celebrate our shared successes. It's a rite of passage, and anthropologists love a rite of passage, and it's a place to share ideas and a time to reflect. So much of the work I'm about to talk about would not have been possible without the help and intellectual partnership of many of you who are here tonight and others who are watching online, I am told. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah, okay, thank you. So, this evening my focus will be on what archaeologists can say about how people lived about 1,000 years ago and how it is we use certain objects to tell this story. And in many parts of the world, archaeology and objects are the only source of evidence that we have relating to the past. And the world of today has instant communication, relatively quick and easy and cheap air travel, usually. And paradoxically, however, if you open a newspaper, it looks like communities are fragmenting and there's increasing distrust between people. Within this modern context, it can be really difficult to imagine what connections would have been like in a more distant past. And tonight, I want to take you back to roughly 11th to 14th centuries AD, and to tell you about networks that span 2, perhaps 3 continents. I'm going to focus on West Africa, and this time period, beginning of 2nd millennium, has been termed West Africa's golden age, and it was marked by increasing communications northwards through the Sahara, and before West Africa became entangled in the Atlantic world. I want to talk about the objects and what they can show us about connections, and I want to think about the people who moved them. And briefly, the points I would like to develop tonight are the fact that the early world was connected to a much greater degree than we have until now realized, that it's important to think not just about objects, but about the people who make them, the fact that archaeology gives us information which no other discipline can, and that a fruitful approach in this sea of data is to focus on one object at a time and on the way societies have made sense of it. So if we go to the starting point, my starting point in any case, West Africa, which has an immense archaeological potential. Population density is still quite low in some areas, particularly the Sahel, which is just south of the Sahara, as John mentioned. Modern occupation has not eradicated evidence of previous occupation at this stage. And in some areas, you can literally stumble upon the walls of houses in which people lived centuries ago, or the remains, the broken pottery, which once contained the food and drink which they consumed. So it's an amazing resource, and a growing number of us are engaged in researching it. So most recently, I collaborated with colleagues from Benin, Niger, and various European countries to investigate one stretch of the Niger River, and I'll be talking about this shortly. As you all know, the Niger River is one of the world's major rivers, and it was a source of fascination and interest for historians and explorers, possibly as far back as Roman times. That's a bit controversial. Certainly, by the medieval period, the Niger River was supporting some extensive empires, some of the most famous empires of West Africa. West African gold and slaves were in high demand throughout the Mediterranean. So these empires were very well known to cartographers, and shown here is an atlas drawn in Mallorca in 1375, and I always find it interesting to see how detailed the African coast is compared to the rather blobby British Isles on the top left. And the guy who is sitting here is Mansa Musa, the ruler of the Empire of Mali. And he was so rich that when he and his retinue arrived in Cairo on pilgrimage, they came with gold from their homeland, and so much did they bring that the value of this metal dipped on the markets for a decade afterwards. As you can see, he was recently designated the richest human being of all time. So this was a very important economic network, and its northern edge was in what is now Morocco, in Sidi Massa, one of the ports anyway, and this is the red dot here. And I'll be mentioning this place again. And from here it took 50 days by camel and on foot to reach the nearest West African capitals. And there were huge amounts of money riding on this trade, and that must have involved extensive networks of credit and trusts. So we know there existed complex wealthy states in West Africa in the early second millennium, and you would think that we know quite a lot about them. Actually, that's not the case. They haven't left us any texts. West African sources are scarce until the 1800s or so. And for all the previous periods, all we have are the rare writings of authors who were based in Northern Africa and the Middle East. And they were fascinated about what they heard about what lay south of the Sahara. But these were not places they had visited themselves. They were passing on second or third-hand knowledge from people who had gone. So their accounts are full of the imaginary and the speculative. Incidentally, these accounts are really fascinating to me for what they tell us about trust. So when you were facing a very long journey into unknown lands, how did you negotiate the security of your person and of your goods? So the job of some of these early geographical writers, in what I can make sense of it, was partly to make the unknown less daunting and to instill confidence in travelers. So you'll find these authors will often name informants, or if they don't know the person's name, they'll say, "A trustworthy person informed me." And it looks like this is a strategy to lend credence to their accounts, but also to reassure the reader that there exist outposts of civilization in distant lands, outposts of familiar culture. So a lot of it looks like it's about making the unknown known. And one of the famous writers, Ibn Battuta, who writes in the 14th century, he's an absolute treasure trove of anecdotes. And he describes daily life on the caravan. These are some scenes of roughly that time period. And he talks about daily life on the caravan between Sidi Massa heading across the Sahara. And he's full of details. He's talking about this annoying guy who won't share his water, or the other one who likes to show off and play with snakes, and then he gets bitten, and then the skin of his fingers falls off bit by bit. So he's very imaged and very, it's very vivid stuff. And when he's telling these stories, there is a sense that he wants to make this road familiar. He wants to make it known to his readers. And he, by the way, was an obsessive traveler who set off on the Hajj, on pilgrimage, at the age of 21 in June 1325. And he didn't stop for the next 24 years. He went to most of the known world at that time, including the Middle East, India, the Maldives, China, and parts of Africa. That's also sometimes debated, but in any case, it seems that much of the work of the medieval authors is about mapping connections and naming informants. They seem to convey the impression that these people keep bumping into each other over immense distances. So when Ibn Battuta arrives in Sidi Massa in Morocco, he stays with someone whose brother he had met in China and in India. How far apart they are, he exclaims, to find him again. So I wanted to give you some detail of these sources because they give you a flavor of what kinds of written records we have. They're really great reading, but they are the anecdotes of single individuals, often who haven't been to the places they describe, and they're really interested in gold and in women and odd creatures. So it's only between the lines that you get indications of some of the more mundane aspects of daily life. They do, however, tell us some interesting things. In particular, they were very clear about the changes which affected West African society from the 10th century onwards with the spread of these traders and the arrival of Islam. So these changes affected very material practices like diet, clothing, architecture. And for instance, if you had pretensions to an international outlook and wanted to seem more sophisticated, you might start to wear cotton robes, or you might eat wheat, or you might build with plaster and baked bricks. And so these changes of material culture show various facets of identity which are intersecting and coming together. And of course, these changes in culture, material culture, are the sorts of things that we might hope to spot archaeologically. So West Africa has an immense archaeological potential. The Niger River, one of the world's major rivers, nourished many of the medieval empires, but the evidence we have to play with is slender. There exists no historical writings. Archaeologically, however, there's a lot of stuff, and I want to show you one example of the sort of archaeological evidence available in West Africa, and this comes from a project which I led with European funding since 2011, called Crossroads of Empires. So I take you here to the Northern Republic of Benin and to a region with the name of Dendi. It's a beautiful landscape. The Niger River by this point has been wending its way across West Africa for some 2,000 kilometers. It started in the forested highlands of Guinea, heads north, passes Timbuktu, practically in the Sahara, and then comes back down south. At the point at which it reaches Dendi, it's beginning to get into better watered regions. It starts to get water from various affluents, which are drawing from better watered regions. And so an inland delta forms at this point, which is quite wide in places. It's very green, it's very rich in fish and in other aquatic resources, as you can see on the top slide. And dotted amongst this are settlement mounds, which I tried to show on the bottom one, which are past occupation sites, characterized by scatters of pottery, largely. And during our 5 years in Dendi, we went back each year, and we worked on a number of sites, but we focused mainly on one called Birnin Lafia, and which is an extremely large mound. It's about 36 football pitches in size. Local people knew it as a past settlement site, but they didn't know much about it beyond that, so we needed to excavate. One component of the work was the extensive horizontal excavation of a large compound in the northern part of the site, where we had identified some mud structures. As you can see, it's all pretty shallow. And we exposed the remains of some buildings over about 100 square meters. There were 6 distinct rooms and courtyards, and all of them, most of them, had pavements of pottered mosaic or iron-rich clayey material. Sometime in the 12th or 13th century, it seems this house was destroyed by a fire, collapsed, and we therefore excavated a snapshot of this event. Alongside this very extensive investigation, we obviously dug quite a few holes much deeper, 12 in total, with the view of understanding how the settlement evolved through time. And at any given point, we had between 2 and 4 meters of occupation. And the radiocarbon dates returned from all of these varied between the 4th and the 13th centuries. We got similar deposits of similar ages, similar appearance throughout the site, which is a strong indication of continuous and long-lasting occupation. So this was a big place, and it was inhabited for several centuries. Generally speaking, what you see, what builds up this mound, is a series of sedimentation layers, floors, collapsed architectural remains, and refilled pits. We also found 2 burials. One was a child, about 6 or 7 years old, right under one of the rooms, and the second was an individual, probably a lady, of the mid-1st millennium AD, with some metal objects near the ears and around the pelvis, and a necklace of about 72 stone and shell beads. And that, again, is really a snapshot of the existence of someone 1,500 years ago. So if we look at the site as a whole, it looks like people settled here 1,500 years ago. Perhaps there was already a small mound which may have been sticking out from the overall marshes nearby, all around. And as they lived here and discarded debris over the period of 1,000 years, the mound became huge, and today it stands 8 meters high. And this is the kind of stuff you find, collapsed, personal effects which were discarded, lots of pottery, and architectural remains. The pottery is quite distinctive. This has been a bit of an obsession of mine, is trying to identify different decoration types, and the one on the left is made with a very short length of folded and twisted palm fiber. The one on the right is incised with some kind of sharp point, and as you may be able to see, it's been rubbed before firing to give it quite a nice fine sheen. So it's like this very nice Romano-British Iron Age stuff, if anybody knows it. So you've got some intact or refitted pots we glued back together. This one was just sitting on the surface of the house undisturbed. So it really is a very nice snapshot in time. And you'll know, of course, that one of the archaeologists' favorite games is looking around to other sites and finding out which pots have ones that are similar to what we've just dug up, hence the interest of this game. In terms of material culture, the other physical things which give us clues about the connections these people had, well, we have stone beads, which may have come from what is now Ghana, and we have other very distinctive glass beads, which are bluish-yellowish, and those occur throughout West Africa, but probably are ultimately of southern Nigerian origin. These places are over 500 kilometers away of where we were working. So in terms of architecture, we also have this wonderfully preserved house of the 12th or 13th century with its pavements of crushed potsherds. The style is comparable to locations farther down the Niger River. We know through the analysis of the food remains that the people at Bernin-Lafia ate a lot of fish. The environment was likely marshy, wetter than it is now, and they cultivated pearl millet and sowed rice on the floodplain. They also grew cotton, which indicates an interest in plants which goes beyond having them just as food. And we also found some pieces of ivory and some seashells, which were brought from several hundred kilometers away. So we get a pretty good picture of this society, and we brought this to Norwich for an exhibition in the Sainsbury Centre in October 2014 to February 15, and we also organized in the spring of 2015 a series of public events in Benin, where we went back and outlined the kinds of things we had found out. Now, after the 14th century, we are not quite sure what happens. Apparently the site was abandoned, and that's a pattern we see elsewhere within West Africa. So whether that is something to do with climate change, a change in the importance of trade routes, which meant it was better to move elsewhere, or disease, we actually have no idea. There's always a possibility we didn't look in the right place. And the thing is, however, we found a similar story throughout the region. And we excavated in many different locations I haven't got time to go into tonight, but the picture was of a very densely populated landscape back at the turn of the second millennium. Now, this work, which took place over 5 years and is still continuing, is the most intensive excavation of such a large settlement mound within about a 400-kilometer radius. There's a lot still to do in West African archaeology. There's a number of comparable sites throughout West Africa, but the region is really vast and there are not enough archaeologists. We archaeologists and historians had all long thought Dendi would be an interesting place to look because of the Niger River as a transport access and as a source of water and fish. It was also thought that trade goods must have moved through here because sites were known in the vicinity, which clearly had been receiving things from afar. And we were fortunate to be able to work there and to show that this region was a major population center some centuries ago. But it's completely invisible in written sources. We have accounts, such as those by Mbatuta. Again, yes, he really is very famous, very useful. Here's a shopping mall in Dubai, where different courts are themed after the different regions he visited. I'm quite dismayed Africa's not there, but anyway. He is speaking, he tells us of vast empires which existed at around the right time and pretty much around this right place, close to Bernin-Lafia, but we'll never know which place exactly he meant. Our region is simply too far south to be known to these medieval authors. So the interpretations we might make rely entirely on archaeology, with some extrapolation from historical sources, but also, and that's important, talking to people in the local communities who, despite the long time lag, do hold traditions about the past historical and political units. And the aspects which I find most fascinating really is trying to get an idea of what the world looked like. So if you were living in Birnin Lafia 700 years ago. What was your known world? What were the areas that you knew firsthand? What were those that you had heard about but never visited yourself? And which objects took on a particular meaning or importance because they came from these faraway lands? And these are the questions which really interest me, but they're quite tricky to grapple with. And although archaeologists have certainly enhanced our understanding of commercial connections during the medieval period in West Africa, we're really only beginning to understand the huge changes which came about with the shifts in political and economic networks. And certainly the first part of this second millennium was a time of huge change with the development or expansion of some of the empires I have mentioned along the Niger River, but also some increasingly intense exchange systems. So those communities which took part in these expanding webs of intra- and intercontinental trade were really confronting new challenges and new possibilities. And it's important to remember this because although we track objects, what is really interesting is the people behind them. So when you think of technological practices, there's always a question at the back of our mind as to how these came about. So where do the craftspeople learn their craft? Thinking of those blue-green beads I mentioned earlier, the West African makers might have heard, they might have seen themselves the workshops where they were made afar, they might even have spent some time there and returned home. Any of these scenarios could have sparked local innovations and changes in glass production and bead technology. So when we talk about trade, and when I use the word trade in this talk, I'm really thinking about behaviors and practices and technical know-how, as well as the sheer mechanics of moving objects from one place to another. And as most of you will know, most of my work over the past years has dealt with pottery and potsherds, broken pots, and how we can, thanks to this study, determine networks of exchange between people. However, in the past 2 years, I've taken a slight turn, and I am now looking at seashells, and specifically the cowrie shell. And archaeologists have always loved shells. Few natural objects have elicited as much interest for archaeologists, whether they are markers of early modern human behavior, as on the right, or as startling evidence of ritual belief on the left, where you can see cowrie shells have been embedded to signify the eyes of this deceased person, ancestor. And cowrie shells have been the object of a great deal of attention, and perhaps none more so than the money cowrie and the ring cowrie, Cyprea moneta and Cyprea annulus. These two shells are relatively small sized, just a few centimeters long, and marine mollusks, they occur widely throughout the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Now, if you compare these two maps, what is quite startling is the prominence of Africa. The map on the bottom shows you places where cowries have been used. The map at the top shows you their natural range. And Africa, I think, immediately stands out for the way in which the populations have embraced cowrie shells, which come from quite far away. Indeed, also in popular imagination, cowrie shells are strongly associated with Africa, and in parts of Africa itself, particularly in Benin, which I know best, cowries are connected with wealth and success, and they're actually used in presidential campaigns by economists. And the way I really came to this topic is also that if you're wandering through the Sahel and you ask people where the past settlement site is, they inevitably know, and they will take you there and they will say, we know this is a past site because every time we go and dig, we find pots full of cowrie shells. So it's kind of this fascinating, and they inevitably, when you ask to see them, they always say, oh no, it was not interesting, we gave it to the children and they broke it. So I spent 20 years trying to find these mystical pots, but it's a kind of analogy, a kind of a metaphor for the archaeological site, in my mind anyway. So the point is that cowrie shells have been used for decoration, as a fertility aid, in divination, and as a currency for some millennia, for some centuries, sorry. And indeed, that was also the case in other parts of the world, such as areas of India, Europe, or China. But the association is especially strong with West Africa, which is quite a remarkable turn of events for an object which came from at least 9,000 kilometers away. So I want us to have a closer look at it. In the late 1990s, colleagues from Frankfurt excavated a settlement in Burkina Faso with an associated burial ground. It's called Kissi, and it seems to have been occupied by settled farmers who kept small livestock, made pottery, and worked iron. And they remained for many generations in the same place, so built up a mound of the kind I just described to you from my own work. And it's not known who their predecessors were. And then after they abandoned the area in the 13th century, nobody reoccupied the settlement. So only nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples live nearby nowadays. What was found by these colleagues in the settlement was broadly in line with what you might expect for that time period, but the big surprise came from the cemeteries, because with the dead were recovered items such as brass jewelry, weapons, textiles, cowrie shells, and glass beads. These are all exotic items of trans-Saharan origin, and some are as old as the 5th century AD. Here are burials dated to the second half of the first millennium, and I'm not sure you can make it out, but on the skull of this individual are a few cowrie shells, and likewise here. So they likely formed part of a headdress which is consistent with what the historical accounts tell us as well. And the important thing, the fact is this represents the most solid evidence to date for pre-Islamic trade across the Sahara. And the important thing is to remember that this was a hierarchical society, seemingly, in which trade and trading networks played an important role. So this community was not cut off from the outside world, but it was instead bound up into a larger network of contacts and exchange. And this is another example that forces us to think about the challenges and opportunities which communities will have faced when they had these expanding trade networks. And again, as we archaeologists track objects, we must not forget that knowledge, goods, and individuals circulated through networks of people, and it is people who assign value and meaning to objects. And the cowrie shell gives you a wonderful example of this process. When Ibn Battuta, the traveler, visited the Maldives, he writes, all transactions take place in the Maldives by means of the cowrie, which is an animal picked from the sea and deposited in pits on the shore. They are sold to the inhabitants of Bengal for rice, because the cowries are also current in Bengal, and also to the inhabitants of Yemen, who use these instead of sand as ballast in their ships. The cowrie is also the currency of the West Africans in their country. I saw 1,150 cowries sold for 1 gold dinar in Mali and Caucau. This was in 1355, and the fascinating thing is that you can see a single object moving from hand to hand over 12,000 kilometers, and depending on who is receiving it, they treat it as currency, as ballast, or as a trade commodity. And that, in my mind, is an excellent illustration of the fact that objects have biographies, and that their path will twist and turn, and individuals and their communities will assign them meaning and value. And cowries came to mean absolutely different things to different people depending on their cultural context. These shells interested writers, and so they wrote quite a lot about them, so we can see this kind of process. We can't see it for other goods, such as pottery, quite so clearly. Cowrie shells they were very interested in. And one person's discards is another person's treasure, and that is never more true than in this case. The historian Al-Umari, living in Syria, writing at about the same time as Ibn Battuta, for me seems to be missing the point a little when he writes of the route across the Sahara leaving Sijil Massa, which he calls the farthest point of inhabited country. And what he says is, it is a land of desolate regions and unknown roads. Those who journey through it are impelled to risk its dangers only by the great profits which they make in West Africa, for they set out with valueless articles and return with bullion as their camel's burden. And it's clear from earlier lines in the paragraph that what he means when he's talking about valueless articles, what he means is salt, copper, and cowrie shells. The bullion, of course, is gold. But in calling these cowries valueless articles, he's assigning value to objects and doing so in a completely different way to the other consumers of the time who were living in West Africa, or for that matter, the Maldives or Northeast India, where they were also highly valued and used as currency. So I want to reinforce the point that value is locally constructed and that people give objects meaning, and sometimes, it must be said, in the face of what we would consider fact. And that brings us back to our work on the Niger River and to the Republic of Benin, which I mentioned a while back. Earlier, I was describing the archaeological remains that we uncovered at the site of Benin Lafia, which were dated between the 4th and the 13th century AD. But as well as excavating evidence of the past, anthropological colleagues in the team spent a fair while talking to people who live in the region today, recording their historical traditions. And I mentioned that cowries are often equated with Africa, and West Africa particularly. And in fact, our work confirmed a very strong association by the people of Dendi themselves. So this obviously is us excavating at a site, and at the background is this very extensive marshy area, which you can also see here blown up. And people locally say that in this place you can find a vast number of cowrie shells. Now, biologically, this is an impossibility because the cowries are a marine species and this is a riverine context, but that's not the point, as far as I'm concerned. The story is about the construction of wealth, and it's about how people are talking about the area and the power which this region once held. So what they say is that the pond is somewhere within the floodplain, known to fishermen alone, and it's widely held to have made the wealth of those who controlled it, thanks to a sacrifice that allowed them to collect cowrie shells. It's usually described as a double sacrifice, human and animal. A particularly beautiful young girl was carefully dressed and brought to the pond together with a black ox. The ox was slain and its skin was laid out in the water, and the girl was brought back to the village. Sometime later, the skin, full of cowries, was removed from the pond, and the girl died of unspecified causes in the following days. The story is really well known locally, and it contains very specific details, such as which way down the ox hide was to be put in the water, the fact it was filled with so many cowrie shells you had to drag it rather than carry it, and the fact that they're very clear an animal was living inside the shell. All of this sounds like a very convincing account passed down by eyewitnesses. But these shells don't actually live in the Niger, so we have a few ideas about what people might be alluding to with these stories, if it isn't these little shells from the Indian Ocean. But it's impossible for us to check because they're no longer there, and informants repeatedly told us that the cowries have gone. And the pond is no longer used. Now, whether it doesn't sit well with Islam, which is the religion of the area nowadays, whether the cowries suddenly disappeared, or whether when the French colonized the area and introduced new currencies, cowries were abandoned, we don't know, but they're no longer there. The point of the story is to show that the appropriation of the cowrie shell, with its association with wealth and success, by a population among whom the cowrie is an alien object, one which has come from really, really far away. And I have to say this really rekindled my interest in the cowrie shell and led me to develop a new project to study them. Because to me, this sort of deep embeddedness of cowries in West Africa suggests that they have for a very long time been reaching this part of the world. It's not the, this is confirmed by archaeological data, as in the case of the burial ground in Kisi, which I showed you a minute ago, where cowries were used 1,500 years ago. This is not the only occurrence of cowrie shells at such an early date deep in West Africa. There are other examples. They're rare, it's true, but they're absolutely compelling. And so in the next part of the talk, I want to think briefly about the routes whereby cowries came to West Africa from the Indian Ocean and the people who brought them. So archaeologically, a really striking example is the position indicated by the red dot here, which has been called the Lost Caravan, and it's dated to the 11th century and was recovered in one of the most inhospitable tracts of the Sahara Desert. It's in the northeastern part of Mauritania, and even today there's not a single road or town within the area. It's 1.5 million square kilometers. And in the 1960s, antelope hunters located a mound in what is essentially, as you can see from that rather grainy picture, a very flat landscape. They alerted archaeologists who recovered a hoard of cowrie shells and brass bars. This was dated to the 11th century. So clearly this is a caravan load, abandoned on its way probably from Sijil Massa to the south. And recall that just 2 or 3 centuries later, we are told by the Syrian writer Al-Umari that salt, copper and cowries are the chief exports southwards. For some reason that we do not know, this caravan was abandoned, possibly fear of attack, sandstorm. It was never retrieved. A few samples were taken by the archaeologists, and these are some of them that a colleague in Senegal sent me a photo of. And however, sadly, the archaeologists, the find spot is in such a remote and featureless area that the find spot was lost again. And so these still are where they were abandoned 1,000 years ago and have never been retrieved to this day. It's a really remarkable snapshot of the past again. It really is a point in time. It's absolute Indiana Jones material. It's very rare. And so we make what we can of it. But alongside this archaeological evidence of the cowrie trade, we have a few anecdotes also which have survived in written form. I mentioned earlier that the writers who tell us about West Africa are largely based in the Middle East and North Africa, but we also, and they're very clear that West Africans were very keen consumers of cowries. But we also have some letters and traders' accounts from around the Mediterranean, and some of the most spectacular have been retrieved from a synagogue in Cairo. I cannot read this. It's just something very nice from the British Library. But people who can read it tell me that this is a letter which was written in May 1141 by a trader who is just about to set off to India. And I hope anybody who can read it is going to tell me I have found the correct letter. But the letter does exist, informing, so this person is writing in May 1141 to his family back in Alexandria. He's about to set off to India. He mentions the boat he's going to sail on in quite a casual way, so it's quite clear that he's done that before and his family back home know all about it. And among the goods that he's sending them are 100 liters of cowrie shells. And he says, you know, you may want to sell these in Spain because they use there as amulets and they're ground up to make eye powder. And presumably also a lot of these would have found their way to West Africa. And these Cairo documents are quite remarkable. And they make many references to Sijil Massa, that trading emporium in Morocco. We also know that gold from West Africa must have been of major importance to the Mediterranean economies, but West Africa is only indirectly represented in these documents through references to Sijil Massa, people from Sijil Massa and such like. The implication is that trade was important in the 11th and 12th centuries, but it's not spelled out. It's taken for granted because you have to remember one factor here might be that these people were writing to business associates and friends. They didn't really need to spell out in great detail things that they took for granted amongst each other. And these are arrangements which were very familiar to them. So when we look at the evidence, we can trace cowries in the Sahara, along the Mediterranean coast and in the Red Sea. We have a number of historical texts from the 10th century onwards which insist that the Maldives were the prime producer of cowrie shells. So they are right at that end of the route. It's a very small group of islands lying in the Indian Ocean off India, southwest of India. It's often been assumed that those early cowries you find in West Africa came from the Maldives, and that's not really been demonstrated. So my current research involves archaeological work in the Maldives, collaborating with local heritage authorities to see what kind of material evidence we get concerning that period of occupation, and also whether we can retrieve any evidence of this trade in shells. We last year managed to locate settlements of that time, and at the minute we are busily engaged in trying to identify, largely on the basis of the pottery we dug up, what kind of trade connections these Maldivians of the medieval period had. And they probably range from China to the Western Indian Ocean. We also, you'll be relieved to hear, found hundreds of cowrie shells, both living and long dead. So we'll be going back to the Maldives early next year. In fact, we hope to go to Imbatutta's island, to find out more. And we'll also be comparing the cowrie shells we've excavated in the Maldives to museum collections throughout West Africa, including those from Mauritania I showed you. That's another story for another evening. I've presented tonight quite a few examples of what sorts of information we have concerning the communities who lived 1,000 years ago and the connections they may have had. As researchers, we always have to navigate carefully because there's a balance, of course, to be struck between getting lost in a forest of detail and going astray with big models and big questions. And then, of course, when you're faced with letters written centuries ago or a chance archaeological find in the desert or from a small number of sites, you always have to wonder what is characteristic and what is not. Each set of data is idiosyncratic, and we need to think about which items represent the characteristic and which represent the odd and the unusual, because any society contains a given number of odd and unusual people. So what I've become increasingly interested in really is who these people were who were moving goods over such long distances. What was their knowledge of the world, and how did they actually make these exchanges work? Because let's remember, this was not a time of easy and quick communication. I'm wondering whether maybe just a small set of people were traveling in order to bring innovations, goods, and know-how to new places. And only these few people knew firsthand of these wider worlds, and when they came back to their communities, they brought prestige in the form of this knowledge and of the objects they were bringing in. Perhaps to some degree they lived on the fringes of society, which is understandable, because the situation we're talking about here is one where goods are transported over distances much wider than a single community, beyond the realm of direct experience, so by definition, you're coming in as an outsider, and you're marginal. And you have brokers who can mediate and accommodate the trader and help you conduct business over cultural boundaries. And this is a model that's really well known in West African anthropology, for instance, and has been used in scholarship for other parts of the world. And trade diaspora is defined as a network of dispersed but socially interrelated communities have interested me for a long, long time. It seems this pattern may well have some deep roots. We have indications, again through written sources, that traders in West Africa may have intentionally maintained this sense of difference, living separately and maintaining the original customs as part of a strategy for creating a community of mutually trusting people. I mentioned earlier that the writers are reporting on material changes affecting West African societies, which include clothing, diet, and building. And in some instances, sources even describe twin towns. You have the foreigner's town and you have the local town. Again, these are the sorts of changes that we might hope to see in the archaeological record. And to my mind, there's something really precarious and also very powerful in being an outsider and being somewhat liminal. And we do have evidence of this kind of behavior in the West African past, which might have happened elsewhere. Norwich was one of these cosmopolitan trade settlements in medieval times. And as you'll probably know, Norwich originally meant the North Port, the North Wick. There's been a lot of scholarly debate on these wicks and how much these settlements were actually embedded within local society or kind of floated on its margins. So, yes, it's difficult to read, and I'm thankful to the colleagues from Norfolk Museum Service who sent me this image very quickly and very lovely. So it does say Norwick towards the top left of the right-hand image. So my points so far have been this. We have clues in written documents, but the material records, which is discarded objects, features, things dug by people or built by people, often are all we have. And that is why archaeology is very important for those of us who study West Africa in the longue durée. Archaeological data are helping us to understand medieval connections in this part of the world. And there's been an increasing concern, not just with things, and the movement of things, but also with people and the movement of practices. A realization that new ways of doing things were traded and acculturated just as surely as were items. And that has involved looking at how people make things, looking at objects with a technological rather than typological approach. So in the final few minutes, I just wanted to develop this final aspect. Because in the past, archaeologists perhaps have tended to look too much at transmission processes and not enough at appropriation and practice. So put simply, if a new type of pottery or a given type of shell starts to be used within a group of people, it's obviously not just about the shell or the pot that is moving. Innovations must be appropriated, and that's to say they have to be inserted into pre-existing cultural frameworks. So technical traditions are not just acquired at a given moment in time, but they're continually reassessed as people live their lives and go about their business. And researchers working on living informants today and who look at the acquisition of technical know-how consider two scales. Again, it's the world that these practitioners know of firsthand and the wider world they've heard about. And this wider world will also influence the way they do things. So here, think back to a medieval writer who is trying to paint a picture of faraway lands which are totally alien to his readership, beyond the Sahara, and he wonders why there's such a lively market for seashells, which come all the way from the Indian Ocean. And with this focus on practices, there's a much more subtle consideration of people and their networks. These networks are not just things you can see from above. They're sets of relations which are created by individuals. And there are many different ways of getting to this information, and Africanist archaeologists are really leading the field in some of these questions. And it's very important. Whether you're looking at the 11th century merchant in Cairo who's moving cowrie shells to Morocco, or whether you're looking at the 13th century household in Benin, which is investing savings in a glass bead which has really interesting colors, or a clay vessel decorated with a new style that they know is fashionable over in the next valley. This is what you're talking about when things are moving. So in conclusion, the circulation of objects involves negotiations of belonging, social position, and power. People give objects value following their own cultural norms and preconceptions. And these are questions on which many people in this department, in the audience tonight, are working. And I've used the cowrie shell as a good example of an early global commodity. South Asians and Africans considered them beautiful objects for personal adornment or wealth, but they were also used by other people as ballasts. And then European traders later in the second millennium started buying slaves using cowrie shells as their currency. And so the value of the object really changed from place to place and from time to time. Researchers continually pushing back the date for the initial start of connections between societies and people of different regions. And really, ideas about globalization and global history have become more and more commonplace in academic discourse and breaking down regional and disciplinary divisions. And alongside this is the importance of thinking about the people who make objects and who choose to use them. And this is where the anthropological approach comes in. This said, archaeology is often our only source of evidence for the past, so really what we need to do is focus on one object at a time, in my sense, and try and think about the way societies made sense of it. Thank you.
It's my pleasure just to say a few brief words, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience before we perhaps adjourn to celebrate Professor Howe's chair in traditional style. I wanted to, on behalf of the university, congratulate you on your chair and on a really fascinating talk, which draws out some of the complexities of both the archaeological method and of the meaning of material culture, which is something that as someone working in the area of film and media, is absolutely fascinating. It's a different era, but it's exactly the same sets of questions. We don't know what people are doing with these objects, which are valued in different ways by different people, and how they're being exchanged. I thought you did a fantastic job of exploring what's at stake in historical sources and in the context where we don't have historical sources, and how we make sense of and value local cultures and narratives, as well as sort of top-down or elite cultures. So thank you very much for your talk. What I'd like to do is to invite a few questions from the audience, and we have a microphone, or possibly two, to facilitate this. So over to you. Please
So thank you for the talk. You mentioned how cowries have been used in medieval times as both currency and ballast. I associate them in today's world with decoration and jewellery on necklaces and bracelets. Well, is there any evidence from the historical period of them being used as jewellery or as decoration?
Oh, that's an easy question. I'm so glad. Thank you, Richard. Yes, the earliest evidence, archaeological and historical, is of them being used as jewellery. The Kisi excavations, but also excavations by colleagues at UCL, 9th century also in Mali. In both cases, these are graves, and the cowries are used as head ornaments. In the Malian case, they were thought to be braided into the person's hair. And the excavators were very excited to note also the presence of copper bangles, and that exactly tallies with what the historical sources are telling us about the women of West Africa wearing cowries in their hair and copper bracelets.
Thank you.
Your traders must have become proficient linguists in order to do business all over the world. How many languages would they have to become reasonably proficient in?
I'm not quite sure, because there's obviously the concept of the lingua franca. So you might argue that Arabic would get you quite far throughout West Africa if you were associating with predominantly Islamized populations. Likewise, in the Indian Ocean, at any given time, you had a series of lingua franca. You know, in later periods, might have been Portuguese, but Persian, I understand, which again I can't read. But I'm wondering whether they could have managed with those. They also, of course, had local brokers who would have helped with that aspect. So I'm afraid I don't really know.
I was just wondering, because you look at West Africa, and that's quite interesting. Because it goes kind of across the Sahara, but I was wondering, because East Africa seems closer geographically, and there was trade there with countries that also relate to the Maldives and stuff. So I was wondering, is there any connection throughout Africa or with East Africa that connects cowrie shells?
That's one of the key questions we're looking at, colleagues here in the audience. We're looking at in the cowrie shell project, because the Cyprea annulus in particular occur naturally on the East African coast. So certainly in the more recent periods, Europeans were using that supply and shipping all of that to West Africa, but we're talking post-1500 AD. What we don't know is earlier on whether these East African cowries were used, whether the trade routes which went to the Maldives were different, possibly, or the goods that people wanted from East Africa might have been wood or slaves or different things, and they didn't really bother with the cowries. But then you get them moving into South Africa at quite an early date. So one thing we pretty much, I think, have ruled out is the idea of a transcontinental trade. That doesn't seem to be much indication of things moving from, say, Kenya due west. You would have had to go up the Red Sea and then to get to West Africa along the Mediterranean coast and then back down, which is a bit surprising, but the literature would suggest marine transport is much easier than hacking your way through the rainforest. So that could be that reason. But the East African cowries we still don't understand very well at all, so we're working on that.
Oh, hi. Well, I know you're not a zoologist, and I'm certainly not either, but we hear a lot about conservation, like ivory tusks of elephants. But what about the effect on these poor little cowries? I mean, in just the Maldive Islands.
The expert is behind you there. From what he tells me, they reproduce quickly, and our informants in the Maldives also seem to indicate the more you harvest, the more you get. So the numbers we have from, say, the 18th century is in the order, I think, of 50 billion shells coming in each year to West Africa, allegedly all from the Maldives, and you do kind of wonder how they maintained that supply. But they do seem to have liked the Maldives as an environment and done very well there.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, so in one of the slides you showed cowrie shells used as adornments for like burials, and I just wanted to know, is there a tradition that still, like, is it still on today in terms of modern traditions, because you were working with local people, so, you know, is there any indication of that?
Sorry, you said anointment, the slide showed?
Yeah, so in one of the slides there was, yeah, there was like a skull with
yes,
the cowries
yeah.
as a decoration, yeah.
No, I think they're considered a bit old-fashioned, but they're still valued as wealth, sort of kind of a symbol of wealth. This said, some of the most bizarre things we excavated in Benin were 2 plastic cowrie shells made in China. So yes, I think that tells you that people are still interested in integrating that, but not in the form of a shell, but a plastic Chinese representation of a shell, which is interesting in itself.
This, I am going to, that's a wonderful note to end this on. I'm going to, in a moment, ask you to join me once more in congratulating Professor Hauer on her appointment to chair. What a fascinating talk, which elucidates the longevity of this term globalisation, which many of us thought associated with more recent times. I believe outside we have some drinks, and there may be plenty of people who want to talk to you, but hopefully an opportunity to ask questions one-to-one as well. So please join me in congratulating.